A long time ago, there was nothing but darkness. It's hard to picture just nothing, but that's all there was, except for God. So God made light, and that way there could be day and night, instead of only darkness. Then God made the sky and the earth, and divided parts of the earth into oceans and seas, and other parts into big pieces of land. God made all the plants and trees, and made them grow on the land. God reached into the sky and made the stars and planets. He made the sun and moon, so that there would always be a day after every night, and spring after every winter. God made these things, just as you can make a picture of your hand in the soil. When he saw all the beautiful waterfalls and mountains, roaring waves and bright blue skies, he knew there was still more to make. God looked at all the water covering the world and decided to make animals to live in the seas. He made big fish and little fish, and many underwater plants. Some were too small to see, while others reached from the bottom of the sea all the way to the surface. For the sky, he made big birds and little birds, bright blue, dark green, and many other colors. When he looked towards the land, God saw grass blowing in the breezes and ripe fruit hanging from the trees. He knew it was a good place for animals, so he made tiny bees and giant elephants, crocodiles, sheep, lions, and all different sorts of animals, but they didn't have names yet. There was plenty of food and water for them all. When God stopped creating the animals, trees, birds, and fish, he looked at all he'd made. He was very pleased. Yet he knew there was still more to make. At that time, there were no people on the earth. God wanted to make someone who would be like him, just as you are probably like your mother or father. So he made the first person. He took a handful of dust, blew on it, then created a life that was the first man. From God's hand, this first man was made, and he was like God. His name was Adam, which means mankind. God brought all the different kinds of animals to Adam and told him they would be called whatever Adam wanted. So he called one a hippopotamus and another a butterfly. He named the birds, everything from flamingo to pheasant. When Adam had finished naming every single creature on earth, God saw that the animals were not able to be Adam's special friend. So, while Adam slept, God took a part of Adam, and around that part, he made someone who was like Adam, but different. She was the first woman. When Adam woke up, he was very happy, because now there was someone like him, someone who could be his friend and helper. But she didn't have a name yet. When God finished making Adam and the woman, he was pleased. He decided he would rest for one day and bless all that he had made. That's why there's one day in every week that God has set aside for us to take a break from work and enjoy the good things he has given to each of us. God chose a special part of the earth and gave it to Adam and the woman. It was a garden called Eden. There flowers bloomed in the brightest colors and the sun shone warmly. In Eden, all the animals lived peacefully with each other, and no one was afraid. Adam and the woman loved God very much, and they were thankful for the beautiful world he'd given them. They walked around their garden with no clothes on, because they had no reason to feel embarrassed. For them, there was one thing even better than all the dazzling flowers, tall trees, and lovely smells in Eden. They knew God cared for them, and they had nothing to hide from him. God told Adam and the woman they could do whatever they wanted. There was just one rule they must follow. God said, "You may eat fruit from any of the trees here, except one. That is the tree of knowledge of good and evil." The two people understood. Of all the animals in Eden, there was one craftier than the rest. That was the serpent. One day, the serpent crept towards the woman and teased her. "Can you eat fruit from all the trees?" the serpent asked. "Oh, yes," the woman answered. "We can eat fruit from every tree but one. God has warned Adam and me that if we eat fruit which comes from the tree in the middle of the garden, we will die." The serpent laughed at her. "You will not die. God just says you shouldn't eat from that tree, because he doesn't want you to be like him and be able to tell good from bad." After the serpent said this to her, the woman didn't know what she should do. She walked over to the tall tree in the middle of the garden and looked up. The fruit didn't look bad. She thought about disobeying God. She knew she had a choice to make. God had given her the freedom to choose whether to obey or disobey. So the woman chose. She chose to disobey God. She picked a piece of fruit and took a bite. Then she brought the fruit to Adam and asked him to eat as well. When they had both taken a bite, they suddenly knew that they had been bad to disobey God. The very moment that Adam and the woman tasted the forbidden fruit, they saw things differently. They looked down at their bodies and realized that they had no clothes on. For the first time ever, they felt embarrassed. So they quickly started making clothes with which to cover themselves. Suddenly, they heard God moving through Eden in the cool evening breezes. They ran through their special garden, frantically looking for a place to hide. The Lord God said to them, "Where are you?" "Don't look, God. We're not wearing very much," Adam called to God. "Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil?" God asked. Adam said, "The woman gave me some fruit to eat, so I did." "But the serpent fooled me, and that's why I ate," the woman said. No matter what they said, it felt as if a cloud were hanging over Adam and the woman. The sunshine felt cold, and for the first time ever, the people were afraid. Adam and the woman were not sure what God might do. They had never disobeyed him before. Now all the bright happiness and security they had shared in the garden which God had given them seemed to be gone. God said to the serpent, "Because you have tempted the woman to disobey me, you must crawl on your belly in the dust. The woman and her children will always be your enemies." Then God turned to Adam and the woman. The Lord was very sad because he must discipline his children now that they'd done the wrong thing. God did this because he cared. He wanted Adam and the woman to know that every choice was their own, but that some choices led to good things, while other choices could be painful. To the woman, God said, "Because you have disobeyed me, I will make it very painful for you to give birth to children. But the special bond I have given you with Adam will remain, and you will be subject to him." The Lord God looked at Adam. "Adam, because you have disobeyed me, whenever you try to grow plants so that you will have food to eat, it will be hard work for you. It will not come easily. And when you die, your body will go back to the dust, because that is where you came from." Adam turned to the woman and took her hand. Then God told them that they must leave the Garden of Eden, because they were not now allowed to eat from the tree of life. Adam and the woman looked at each other. They were together, but they felt frightened of all that lay ahead. When they left Eden, they would have to work hard in order to find enough to eat. Adam gave the woman a name then. He called her Eve, which means living. Adam and Eve bowed their heads. They felt very sad. They knew God would continue to show his love for them. But the worst part of their punishment was that they would never be as close to God as they had been before they chose to disobey him. After Adam and Eve left Eden, they took care of each other and soon started a family. God gave them a boy, and they named him Cain. Later they had a second little boy, whom they called Abel. Cain and Abel grew up together, helping their parents live in the world outside Eden, where they had to work hard to make sure there was enough to eat. Cain's way of helping the family was to grow crops. He loved to be outside and feel the wind in his hair, and look forward to the rain which watered the seeds he had planted. The grain he grew could be ground into flour for making bread. He also gathered vegetables and fruit, which helped keep the whole family healthy. Abel's way of helping was to raise sheep and goats. He would milk the goats and give it to his parents, so that the family had milk to drink. Sometimes he killed one of his sheep, so they could eat meat which would make them strong. One day, Cain gathered some of the crops he'd grown and offered them to God as a present, a way of saying thank you for all God had done for the family. Abel did the same, but he chose the first lamb born to one of his sheep to give back to God. God was pleased with Abel and his present, but he rejected Cain and his present. This made Cain angry. God said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why are you scowling? If you had done the right thing and chosen the best to give to me, you would be smiling, because I would have been pleased with your gift. But you've done wrong. You have to learn to say no to what is wrong and choose to do good instead." Cain wanted to be angry. He didn't think God was being fair. God had said Cain had a choice. Cain chose to be angry. He came up with a plan. He called Abel out to the fields, where Cain had worked so hard to grow his crops. There, out in the open, Cain did something dreadful. He killed Abel. God called to him, "Cain, where is your brother Abel?" Cain pretended he didn't know. God said, "You have done wrong. As your punishment, you will no longer be able to grow your crops. I will not allow the land to give grain and fruit and vegetables to you. No matter how hard you work, the crops you grow will always die. Instead, you must spend the rest of your life wandering, never finding a true home." Cain hadn't thought of what might happen after he killed Abel. He was learning that every choice carries consequences. Now he regretted what he'd done to his brother. After all, Abel had been Cain's best friend. He was also scared about where he would find food if he couldn't grow it. Worst of all, although God promised to protect Cain from harm, Cain was going away from God's presence. God sent him to a land east of Eden, to the land of Nod, which means wandering. In the years to come, God gave many children to Adam and Eve, and to Cain and his wife. They too had many children, who had children, who had children. Just like your great-grandfather had your grandfather, who had your father, who had you. After some time, most of the people living on earth had chosen not to live close to God anymore. They no longer taught their children to thank God for the good things he gave them. They chose to hurt and lie and do wrong rather than be good. God looked at the people and grew very sad. He saw that they no longer even tried to do right. He saw all the pain they caused each other and themselves. And he wished he had never created people with the rest of the animals on earth. Unlike the animals, people did bad things just for the sake of hurting. God decided he would take away the lives on earth that he had created. During this time, when so many people were bad, there was one man who was different. His name was Noah. Noah often asked God's help in living his life. Noah listened for God's answers and then obeyed him. This pleased God. God told Noah, "I'm going to put an end to all people. I will cause a huge flood to cover the land, and everyone will drown. But I will spare you and those you love. Build a big boat, and build it in the way I tell you to. Then fill it with 2 of every type of animal. Fill it with food for yourselves and them, and you will be safe." When Noah heard God's plans, he grew afraid. Yet he knew God could be trusted. So Noah did as God told him. God gave Noah the plans for making the boat, which was called an ark. It was especially designed for floating, just right for surviving a flood. As Noah built the ark, his neighbors didn't know what to think. They said, "But where's the sea? We live near the desert." Noah told them what God had said, that there was still time to say sorry to God and live good lives. But his neighbors just laughed. When the ark was finished, Noah's family climbed in, and with them went the animals and birds, creeping creatures and crawling things. What a sight it was! And the noise was enough to bring Noah's neighbors out to watch and shake their heads all over again. There were lions roaring, donkeys braying, dogs barking, birds singing, and sheep bleating. 2 by 2, the animals entered the ark, all different types and shapes and sizes. Tiny worms wiggled, horses pranced, and rabbits hopped. When all the animals were inside, God closed the door to the boat. Then it began to rain. It rained and rained. The water poured out of the skies as if the clouds contained waterfalls instead of raindrops. For 40 days and 40 nights, the rains fell. Noah's ark went higher and higher, carried by the water to heights as tall as mountains. In fact, the water rose so high, the mountains disappeared underwater. As the land flooded, all the living things on earth drowned, all the people and animals and birds, for there were no dry places on which to live. The water was everywhere. As days dragged into weeks, Noah and his family felt as though they'd always been surrounded by the smells and sounds of 1,000 animals. There was no difference between night and day, since they stayed inside all the time. And the sun couldn't shine anyway, because dark rain clouds blocked its light. God did not forget his promise to Noah. When the 40 days were over, God sent a wind over the earth, and the water level started to drop. Noah woke up to darkness, as he had since the storm started. But that morning, something was different. He checked his family. They were still asleep. The animals were quiet. The ark rolled from one side to the other, as it had ever since the storm started. What was different? Then he knew. Noah could hear the waves slapping the sides of the great boat. Before that day, the sounds of rain had kept him from hearing the waves. The rains had finally stopped. Noah ran through the boat, waking everyone up. "It's over! The flood is over! Oh, let's thank God for sparing us and ending the storm!" he shouted from one end of the boat to the other. So the family gathered to give their thanks and praise to God. But it wasn't until months later that the waters went down enough for the ark to find a mountain top on which to rest. Some months later, Noah and his family went on deck for the first time. All they could see was water in all directions, broken by the tip-tops of mountains poking their way above the surface. Noah waited another month before he let a raven out to see if it could find dry land. But it was too early. Then he let a dove fly away and try to find a dry place to settle. At first, the dove came back. But a week later, Noah let the dove go again. And this time it returned with an olive leaf in its mouth. That meant there were places dry enough for trees and plants to grow. Noah waited one more week, and then sent the dove out again. But this time, it did not come back. The dove had found a place to land. Many months after the storm had started, Noah took the roof off the ark and saw that water no longer covered the ground. Nearly 2 months later, there was not even any mud left. Noah and his family had been in the ark for a very long time, and they were just as anxious as the animals to get out and start walking around again, exploring the fresh, clean earth. God said to Noah, "You, your family, and all the animals may leave the boat, go onto the land, and build homes." The animals couldn't wait to get off the ark. They tossed their heads and made even more noise leaving than they had when they got on. Shrieking and snorting, mooing and mewing, 2 by 2 they charged down the gangplank and made their way across the land. When the boat was empty, Noah and his family built a big table called an altar. There they thanked God for keeping them safe during the long time at sea. When God heard their thanks, he was so pleased, he promised never to destroy all living creatures again. He promised that as long as the earth lasted, summer would follow winter and day follow night. Then God made something very special. Using every color, he made the first rainbow. As a sign of my promise never to flood the whole earth again, I have set my rainbow in the clouds. Noah's sons had many children, who had many children, who had many more children. The families spread out across the land, learning how to farm, raise animals, and build great cities. Because they all came from the same family, all the people spoke the same language. When strangers came from far away, anyone could understand them when they spoke. Some of the people said, "Let's build the biggest and best city ever built, so we can be famous and not have to wander anymore. We will finally have a home." The people were clever. Instead of using stones, they made bricks and stuck the bricks together with tar instead of mortar. Their walls were the strongest and highest ever. And they were very proud of themselves, choosing not to thank God for the materials they used for building. "We are so clever," they said. Inside the city was a huge tower. The people thought they were such good builders, they could make that tower as high as the sky. When God saw what the people were trying to do, he knew he must stop them, or they would soon think of themselves as gods instead of people. They would be too proud. So he mixed up their language. The people no longer spoke one language, but many. If one man said, "Hello," the other man didn't know what he'd said. He thought he might be saying, "Could I borrow your tools?" It was hard to get anything done, let alone finish a great tower. The city they never finished building was called Babel, which means mixed up, because there the Lord mixed up the language of the whole world. Then God caused the people to scatter to many different parts of the earth. So now there were people living everywhere, and there was no way at all for them to plot and scheme and grow proud of themselves. Many years later, there lived a man named Abram. He and his wife Sarai lived in the land of Haran. They had many sheep, cattle, goats, and camels. Abram and Sarai were happy. Although Abram and Sarai stored their things in tents, they often slept outside. Nighttime in the desert helped to bring God very close. They could feel his presence when the sky stretched like an endless blanket of stars. Often on such nights, Abram and Sarai wished for a child. But the years went by, and none came. One star-filled desert night, when the creatures of the dark were singing and Sarai lay asleep at his side, Abram heard God speaking to him. Abram walked a short way into the desert. There God told Abram some amazing things. "Abram, I will make you into a great nation, and I will take care of you, and all people everywhere will be blessed because of you." Abram lay shaking in the sand. He couldn't believe his ears. Why had God chosen him? The Lord told Abram to leave his home at Haran. Even though Abram didn't know where the Lord would lead him and his family, he obeyed God. He trusted that God would take care of him. He told Sarai what had happened, and she trusted too. She ordered everyone to pack the tents onto the camels. "Gather the food into bundles and get ready for a long trip," she told them. "But where are we going?" they asked. "I do not know," she said, smiling. Both Abram and Sarai were happy to wait for God to tell them where they were going. God led Abram and Sarai, all the camels, hundreds of sheep and goats, many servants and all their children, to the land of Canaan. There the Lord said to Abram, "This is the land I will give to your children." But God didn't want Abram to stop in Canaan. Not yet. Sarai and Abram followed wherever God led them through the desert. But there came a time when they ran out of food. So they went to Egypt, where they'd heard there was enough to eat. Just before they arrived, Abram said, "Sarai, tell the Egyptians you're my sister. I'm afraid the king of Egypt might try to kill me so he can marry you." He was right. When Abram and Sarai and all their animals and servants arrived in Egypt, the king, or Pharaoh, heard of Sarai's beauty and wanted to marry her. He sent his soldiers to bring her back to the palace. When Sarai was at the Egyptian palace, Pharaoh sent many donkeys, cattle, servants, and camels to Abram in thanks for his sister. But of course, Sarai was not his sister, and Abram felt miserable. Because Pharaoh had taken Sarai, the Lord made him and his household ill with many different diseases. Pharaoh realized he must have offended God when Sarai came into his palace. He realized Sarai must be Abram's wife, not sister, and that God was punishing him for trying to marry her when she already had a husband. Pharaoh sent for Abram. "Why did you do this to me? Why did you lie and say Sarai was your sister? You've caused nothing but trouble for me." "Here," Pharaoh shouted, "take her back and get out of Egypt." Abram gave Sarai a big hug. They were both very happy to be back together. They packed all their belongings, including the food they'd come for, and headed out of Egypt. Abram and Sarai traveled back to the land of Canaan. There the Lord said, "Abram, take a good look. One day I will give this land to you and your children. I will make your family very large. They will become as many as the grains of dust on the ground, too many to count." Once again, Abram was amazed at all God promised him. He told Sarai, and she believed too. They still had had no children, but they trusted God and were willing to wait. Abram and Sarai moved their tents near the sacred trees of Mamre at Hebron. The big trees there gave them plenty of shade. Many years passed, and there was still one thing they wished for, and that was a child. So many years had gone by, though, that Sarai was too old to have children. Abram and Sarai didn't understand how God could have promised them children. They felt confused. What had God meant? Then, one night, Abram heard God speak to him again. Abram, who was by then an old man, said, "Lord, the one thing you could give me you haven't, and that is a child. Why haven't we had any children?" "You will have a child, though, Abram," God said. "Look up and count the stars." Abram saw the sky stretch from horizon to horizon, stars blinking in every direction, and he wondered what God could mean. "One day, there will be as many children of your children as there are stars," God said. Abram had a choice. He could decide not to believe the Lord, because he didn't understand how God could do this great thing. Or Abram could choose to trust what God said, even though he had no idea how it would happen. It was a little like letting someone else lead you through a room when your eyes are closed. You cannot see, but the person by your side helps you along step by step. That's what God did for Abram. He stayed by his side every step of his life. Abram waited and believed that God would keep his word. The years went by until finally Abram was 99 years old. Then the Lord appeared to Abram again and reminded him of the promise he had made. As a sign of how serious the promise was, God asked Abram to make a special mark on his body and see that all the men and boys in his camp did the same. This showed the promise was meant to last forever. God would not forget. Then he gave Abram and Sarai new names. Abram became Abraham, which means father of many, and Sarai became Sarah, which means princess. God promised Abraham that Sarah would have a baby, and that the baby would grow into the father of many children. They would all become God's chosen people. A short time later, Abraham saw 3 men walking nearby. He ran over to them and bowed low. "Please, come and stay with us, and let me get you something to eat and drink." Abraham told Sarah to bake some bread as fast as she could. Then he hurried to kill his fattest, choicest calf, and told his servant to cook it as quickly, but as well as he could. Now Abraham didn't realize that one of the 3 visitors was actually the Lord. When Abraham gave the visitors their food, the Lord said, "Where is your wife, Sarah?" "In the tent," Abraham said. "Sarah will soon have a son," the Lord said. Sarah had been listening through the tent wall. When she heard this, she thought it a strange joke by the visitor. They were too old for babies. So she laughed. Then the visitor said, "Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord to do?" And when he said that, Abraham knew the visitor was the Lord. When it was time for the men to leave, Abraham walked with them to the top of a nearby hill. From there they looked down on the city of Sodom. The Lord said, "I have heard how terribly evil the people are who live in Sodom. If it's true, then I will destroy that place." Then the 2 men who had traveled with the Lord, who were really angels in disguise, set off for Sodom. The Lord stayed with Abraham. Abraham wasn't sure what he should do. There was a question he wanted to ask of the Lord, but did he dare? He knew, though, that the Lord was his friend as well as his God. So he swallowed hard and asked, "Lord, what if there are 50 good people in Sodom? What will happen to them? It would not be like you to kill the good people with the bad." The Lord said, "I will not harm the city if there are 50 people who still care." Then Abraham repeated his question several times, each time using smaller numbers. Would he spare the city for 45 good people, for 40, 30, 20, or for 10? Each time the Lord replied that he would spare the city if there were that number of good people. The only bright spot in the evil city of Sodom was a man called Lot. Lot was a nephew of Abraham. He lived in Sodom with his wife and 2 daughters. Lot met the angels, who were disguised as men, and said, "Come to my house. There you will be safe from the people here." It was dark, and Lot and his guests had finished eating when suddenly they heard shouting outside. Lot opened the door and saw hundreds of men carrying torches and shoving their way towards his home. "Give us the 2 men who are visiting you," they shouted at Lot. Then the angels caused all the evil men outside to go blind. That way they couldn't even find the door to Lot's house. "Hurry," the angels said to Lot. "The Lord cannot stand the evil of Sodom, and he will destroy it by tomorrow." The angels led Lot, his 2 daughters, and his wife out of the city in a great hurry. Then, just after sunrise, the Lord caused fire to come out of the sky and drop onto Sodom and nearby Gomorrah, which was also an evil place. Lot's wife was not supposed to, but she looked back to watch. Instantly, she became a pillar of salt. God had kept his promise to Abraham. He took care of the good people in Sodom. Sarah decided she wouldn't wait until God finally gave her a child. So she told her slave girl, Hagar, that she and Abraham could have a baby. When Hagar knew she was pregnant, she teased Sarah, who had no children. So Sarah was cruel to Hagar. The Lord comforted Hagar. "One day, the sons of your son, Ishmael, will be too many to count. I will watch over them and take care of them." But bad became worse. When Sarah finally had a baby of her own, she sent Hagar and her son into the desert. Hagar did not have much food and water. They walked and walked over the dunes through the hot desert. There was no place to rest in the shade. There were no trees, no plants, just sand stretching for mile after mile. Mother and son began to cry. Then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well of water. From then on, God made sure Hagar and Ishmael always had enough to eat and drink. As Ishmael grew older, he became an expert with the bow and arrow. God kept his promise, and the many sons of Ishmael became a nation apart from the one God promised to Abraham. God had promised Sarah and Abraham a child, and Sarah shouldn't have worried. When the 3 strangers visited Sarah and Abraham, the Lord promised they would have a baby within a year. Sure enough, in less than a year, the impossible happened. Sarah, far too old to have children, gave birth to a son. Abraham was 100 years old when Sarah's baby was born. He and Sarah were so happy and thankful to God for finally answering their prayers. The child made them so happy they would often laugh together. So they called the baby Isaac, which means he laughs. The boy was a good reason to laugh and be happy. "Abraham," the voice of God called, "take your son, your special son Isaac. I know how much you love him, and this is why I ask you to do this difficult thing. I want you to give Isaac back to me." This meant Isaac would have to die. Abraham said nothing. The God he knew would never want Abraham to kill his own son. He knew that. God had promised that Isaac would have many children. How could that happen if Isaac were dead? Abraham knew he could choose not to trust God, say no, run in fear and try and hide. But who can hide from God? Or he could choose to trust. Perhaps there was more to God's plan than first seemed to be there. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and woke Isaac. "Come, Isaac, we're going on a journey." Isaac was excited. He liked nothing better than to go travelling with his father. Abraham asked Isaac to carry the wood for the sacrifice they were going to make to God, while he carried the knife. Isaac had often worshipped the Lord with his father. He knew how important it was to give thanks to God for all the good things God gave them. But this time, his father was quieter than usual, and besides, there was something missing. "Father?" Isaac asked. "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said. "But where is the lamb which we usually offer?" Abraham answered, "God will provide one." After 3 days of travel, they reached their destination. Abraham told Isaac to climb onto the altar. Isaac didn't know what his father intended to do. Abraham stood over Isaac, holding the knife up high. He was just about to kill his son when an angel called to him from heaven, "Abraham! Abraham!" Abraham stopped, his hand in mid-air. "Don't hurt the boy. Your willingness to do what God asked shows that you trust God with everything, even the life of your special son, Isaac." Abraham looked and saw a ram whose horns were caught in a nearby bush. That was the offering God had provided. Isaac was still trembling as his father helped him from the altar. The angel called down from heaven again. "Abraham, God says that because you trusted him completely, he will make your family as many as the stars in the sky. All the other nations in the world will be blessed through you."